In today's video, we're going to look at exercises for improving hip joint mobility. When I'm assessing people in the clinic, there are certain movements and motions of the hip joint that are often limited. So I'm going to cover some exercises to basically help you gain hip mobility at home. So if that's a concern you have, stay tuned for today's exercises. So when I'm assessing people in the clinic, probably the motion that's the most limited for the most people is hip internal rotation. So if you look at my leg, hip internal rotation is basically when my knee is straight, it involves my foot turning in. So this thigh bone, what you want to pay attention to is my femur here, which is part of my hip joint, when that femur bone turns in. So what we're going to do is look at a way to stretch that movement. So what you're going to do is sit down on the ground. One of the best ways to do this is to start down, and what you're going to do is have one leg sort of in internal rotation and one leg in external rotation. So you're going to sit like this. You can see my knees are pretty close to 90 degrees. So I'm thinking about this back leg, this hip on the back leg. If you can imagine again, that bone, that femur bone is turning in. It's a little confusing because my knee is bent, so now my foot is out, but that femur is turning in. People who are restricted with hip joint internal rotation will often feel discomfort in their groin. So if you feel that, that's okay. It just means that your joint is probably tight in that movement. My other hip here is in external rotation. This is pretty easy for most of us because a lot of us sit with our leg crossed, so our joint is used to that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at being in this position. Some people won't be able to sit up as straight as I am. If you have to kind of lean back, that's okay. Just start where it's comfortable for you. And you're going to hold this position over time, try to kind of work up to sitting up straighter and really looking at, again, probably a stretch in the groin area. Now what you can do over time to work on this so that you're working both legs is sit here like this, but then see if you can spin over and get the other leg. So now this hip is an internal rotation, this hip is an external. And I'm going to kind of work back and forth. I can hold each position. I'm a little tighter on my left hip. I can feel it more here. Hold each position, kind of go back and forth. You can hold for a few seconds. You can hold up to even a few minutes for joints. Okay, so then once we've worked on kind of passive mobility like this, where my muscles are relaxed, we're going to add an active mobility component. So say I've been stretching a little bit. Now I'm going to try and use my muscles to work on this internal rotation. So I'm going to keep my leg in this position and fire my muscles and try to lift my foot off the ground like that. Okay, so now for a lot of people, if your joint's really stiff, this is going to be really hard, so just do your best. Even if you just think about kind of activating your muscles and lifting your leg, that's okay. Maybe you do 3 to 6 repetitions. It'll get tired pretty fast. This is challenging, so we're really working the muscles at end range. And then you can switch to the other side. The same type of thing. Work on using those muscles to turn your femur into even more internal rotation so that your ankle lifts off the ground. If you imagine this is coming from my hip, even though my foot's lifting, this is all one unit. My muscles are firing to lift my foot off the ground. Okay, so again, work back and forth between those two and then add in that active component. So that's our first hip internal rotation drill. For our second mobility exercise here, we're going to look at a stretch that really targets the back side of the hip joint. We call it the posterior capsule. This can help with internal rotation, which we were just talking about. It can also help with flexions, which flexion is basically pulling your knee up towards your chest. Sometimes when people do this, they'll feel tightness, and again, they might get some of that groin pain I was talking about a second ago. So to stretch this area, to kind of stretch the muscles and some of the soft tissues that can restrict this movement or that internal rotation, what we're going to do is go over on all fours, and what you're going to do, I'm going to stretch my left leg. So I'm going to have my left leg here sort of towards midline, kind of underneath my body, and I'm going to kick my right leg back behind and kind of cross over. So it's going to cross over that leg and kind of stretch behind. Now what I'm looking for here is to kind of drop that right leg back, and I'm looking for a stretch. You'll probably feel it kind of in your glute region here, but I'm looking to feel it kind of in that back area of my hip joint. Now, this is definitely kind of a muscle stretch and has a joint emphasis with it, but for this one, you can get in there and kind of hold, 20 to 30 seconds, and there's different ways you can play with it. I can sink this back leg back farther to get more of a stretch. I can try leaning towards the leg to get more of a stretch. And then I can also even just put my arms down. Now this one going down to my forearms is often really increases this stretch for people and is really gonna, just make that intensity more. It's probably gonna be one of the most effective for kind of targeting the joint. So again, I start to feel some of this in my groin, and I definitely feel it back in the glutes. Be careful with how hard you push those groin symptoms, because sometimes that can just flare your hip joint up, especially if you've got hip impingement or a labral tear. I actually have a labral tear in this hip, so I have to be careful with how hard I push it. So just take it to kind of mild to moderate stretch and discomfort, kind of hang out there and hold it, and then kind of give it a break. Especially, like I say, if you're getting some of those groin symptoms, don't push too hard into that or hang out there too long. It might just kind of flare your joint up. Okay, so that's our second exercise. It's really kind of a glute and posterior capsule stretch. The last movement we're going to look at is hip extension. This is basically when your leg goes behind you. So my femur goes back, which obviously, as you can imagine, is a really necessary movement for things like walking and running. But again, a lot of people are restricted here. It could be their joint. Sometimes it's hip flexor tightness. If your hip flexor muscles on the front side of the joint are tight, it may restrict your hip extension. So we're going to look at two ways to improve this. One's going to be a stretch, and then one will be more of an active mobility drill. So first is the stretch. You want to grab something like a pad or a thick mat you can put down. You're going to put your knee down on that. The pad is there just to make it comfortable for your kneecap. But what we're going to do, a lot of people are familiar with this, it's kind of a classic hip flexor stretch. I'm going to squeeze my glutes and my abs. I'm trying to rotate my pelvis into posterior pelvic tilt, which right away puts my hip flexor muscles on tension. And then I'm going to shift forward until I feel a stretch really on the front of my hip here. I don't want to arch my low back, okay? So this is meant to you're going to kind of brace with your abs and your glutes, which will help with the stretch and stabilizing your spine. So just shift forward slightly until you feel a stretch here. So you can see my leg, right, is going behind my body, so it's creating hip extension. So I'm getting kind of a passive stretch here. This again is really more of kind of like a muscle stretch for the hip flexors. So for this, again, look at 2 to 4 repetitions of 20 to 30 second holds. Okay, so we're going to start with this. We're going to do this passive stretch. We're going to do it 2 to 4 times, and then we're going to do kind of an active mobility drill to help improve hip extension even more. Okay, so start with this one. Now we'll look at the next one. For this continued idea of stretching into hip extension, again, if your hip flexors are tight, this can affect your ability to get into hip extension. Besides stretching the hip flexors, sometimes it actually works really well to activate them, to recruit them, but in an eccentric fashion where they're getting longer. So what you're going to do is find a surface at your house, probably your bed, something that's up higher like this. And what we're going to do is get right to the edge. And if I'm working on my right leg, I'm going to pull my left knee to my chest and roll back and let that right leg just hang. You can also rest your head. But now you can see, right, gravity is wanting to pull this hip into extension. That leg is wanting to drop behind my body, just like I was doing a second ago when I was kneeling. So now I could just hang out here and do a stretch and make it passive, but what I want to do to make this active and work those hip flexors is I'm going to bring that leg up. So I've got to contract my hip flexors concentrically to lift my leg, and then my hip flexors are going to lengthen and contract eccentrically as I go down slowly to the bottom position. Okay, so start out just doing leg weight like this. You might do 2 to 3 sets of 10 to 15 repetitions, let it get all the way to the bottom, and then lift again. So I'm basically strengthening my hip flexors, and we've found in the research that strengthening, especially with an eccentric contraction, the way down where the muscle is getting longer, can actually help improve flexibility and mobility. Some people have chronic hip flexor tightness, and what actually ends up helping them is not just continued stretching, but strengthening and activating the hip flexor muscles. So now look, this will probably get easy after a while. What you can do, if you have a kettlebell, is hang it on your foot, or use an ankle weight. Just add weight to this, and then you've really got to work on controlling that extra weight as the leg drops. You let it go all the way to the bottom. Imagine I'm hanging a kettlebell there, or I've got that ankle weight. Then I've got to lift it back up. So I'm really going to strengthen those hip flexor muscles and teach them to move through a greater range of motion. Okay, so again, this one's kind of a strengthening exercise. We're using it for mobility, but I would go for 2 to 3 sets of 10 to 15 repetitions. Okay, so those exercises are really going to work on some of the movements, really 3 movements that I often see limited in the clinic. We've got hip internal rotation, hip flexion, and then hip extension. Now your hip has 6 other movements, so you could have limitations in other areas, but these 3 tend to be the most common. So give these exercises a try. If you have any questions, put them in the comments section. Also, I just want to mention, you guys, if you need another resource, my book comes out at the end of this month. It's called Rehab Science. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, everywhere you get books. But it has rehab programs for the 30 most common conditions, including several for the hip, and one that's really focused on the hip joint for impingement and labral tears. A lot of the exercises I'm showing here you'd find in that book, and it would break a program down into 3 phases, be more comprehensive than what you find in my YouTube videos. So if you're looking for a resource like that, I'll put the link to the book in the description down below, so check that out, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.